There's a recent documentary on Netflix entitled Pepsi, Where's My Jet? You all notice this on Netflix? Okay. The documentary goes back to a Pepsi commercial from the 90s that was a promotion that Pepsi was running, a point program where the more you drank Pepsi, the more points you would earn. And the points would buy you cool stuff. So for instance, the commercial indicated that 120 points worth of Pepsi products would buy you a cool jean jacket. 80 points would buy you a pair of sunglasses. And then finally, to really put the icing on the cake, a 14-year-old boy descends in what was a Harrier jet at the time and opens up the lid as if he was flying it, the cockpit lid, and in the bottom it says, 7 million Pepsi points, quote unquote, Harrier jet. Now, for the majority of those watching the commercial, they understood what was to be a tongue-in-cheek sort of way of promoting a point program. They understood it to be a rhetorical device used to push Pepsi that 7 million points wouldn't really buy you a Harrier jet, but of course, one 20-year-old man at the time watched it and said, there's no disclaimer. They really just said, if I drink 7 million points worth of Pepsi, that they'll give me a Harrier jet. And in fact, he was right. There was no disclaimer at the bottom of this promotion. So he wrote up a business plan and he started to work. Now, I won't give away the ending, in part because I haven't actually finished it. But suffice it to say that he started drinking and then storing a ton of Pepsi. Now, for our purposes today, I want to make the point that words matter, but not all words are to be taken literally. Along with Matthew 24, there's a relatively obscure passage in the book of Revelation that's been taken quite literally for about 100 years. The passages from Revelation 20, verses 1 through 6, speak of a time when Satan will be bound and Christ will come to reign for 1,000 years. This, in some terms, is known as the millennial, or the millennium, in Christian theology. Now, since the late 1800s, of the publication of what was known as the Scofield Reference Bible, which was actually published in 1909, the passage kind of lay dormant, but came to life, along with Matthew 24, in these prophecies of the promised one, or Son of Man, returning into what is known as dispensationalism. Now, I feel like I'm going to be a little bit like staring at the sun without sunglasses today, dealing with what is a very prominent belief system in American Christianity. And I wanted to do it justice, but I also want to push on what is a dominant thread of our Christian tradition and maybe offer another way forward. What is dispensationalism exactly? And how has it become the backbone and heartbeat of American evangelicalism? Well, a student at Liberty University who really was sort of steeped in the waters of dispensationalism tried to encapsulate it and did a wonderful job summarizing what it is. He writes this: "We believe that the sacred scriptures, the book of Revelation in particular, foretold a day when Jesus would return to the earth to obliterate evil and offer his followers a prized place in God's kingdom. The Bible for us wasn't so much a way to be as much as it was a blueprint for what was to come. My school then was a hotbed for popular theology among evangelicals called dispensationalism, which divides history into distinct ages or dispensations. Now, according to this teaching, when first century Jews rejected Jesus, a new church age began in which Christians would act as God's chosen people. This dispensation will continue until God takes Christians to heaven, leaving the unchosen behind for a period of turmoil. This is what's known as the rapture and the Great Tribulation." Now, he continues and says, while dispensationalism teaches that God is currently focused on the Christian church, believers in this theology assert that when the last days arrive, God will draw the Jewish people back to Israel, where they will rebuild the temple and eventually accept Jesus as the rightful Messiah. This will trigger the return and the reign of Jesus, the millennium, not falcon. So our reading today is one of the texts that would illustrate one of the components of this dispensationalism. Which part? It's when two are in the field and one is walking and the other is lifted. Two women by the grain. One is lifted, the other remains. Many of you may know the book series called Left Behind. Some of you may know what was called Piercing the Darkness, or This Present Darkness, which is what I grew up with. Molly, you too? Now, I kind of wrote this just because I wanted to explore it. I don't know how helpful it will be for you all. There was something, in fact, quite telling when Leslie said, having grown up in this church for 40 years, not grown up, but coming to college, and having lived in this church, she said, I didn't swim in those same waters. And it was kind of refreshing to know that there was a Christianity that wasn't really governed by this dispensationalism. So you may ask, why are you sharing this at this point, Pastor Adam? Why are you digging into dispensationalism? And it's a fair question. And I don't know. No, I'm kidding. Then I'll respond. Now, admittedly, I grew up in these waters. I grew up in this environment. Most of my religious upbringing wove in and out of this blueprint. And so these questions and materials I just wanted to explore myself. But secondly, this worldview still dictates much of evangelical worldview of politics, faith, and priorities. It also leads to some pretty dastardly consequences. Now, among the most nefarious effects of this blueprint belief system of reading the scriptures in this way, as if there are stages and returns, and a blueprint of what is to come, whether it be tragedies, whether in the Middle East, America, or the environment itself, it serves as evidence of God's coming judgment. And as God's coming judgment hastens, so does Jesus' return. So tragic international events or national events mark the end times, the great getting up and return of Christ for 1,000 years. In this worldview, take for an example an issue like climate change. Elements that we can participate in, like recycling, composting, water collection, or consuming less meat, means very little, as this world is bound to decay and for God's judgment. We are simply waiting on a new heaven and a new earth, the next stage, which is to come, the kingdom stage, as it's considered. Our impact on the environment then means little, as does things like prison reform, femicide, police reform, or even personal growth or the plight of the oppressed. Why? Because this world is not my home. There's another stage yet to come when Christ will return. A return to Jerusalem, then, is what ultimately matters. The establishment of the Jerusalem temple and the rescue of as many souls as possible from the great coming tribulation. Things like care ethics for this present world or longing for something better is exchanged for the sequencing of times and events that will trigger Jesus' reign, the Harrier jet of salvation. The thought, what now? The thought, what now, O God? Or where are you now, Christ? Or where are you coming, Christ? Is substituted for when are you coming, Christ? The imagination is shaped by the blueprint rather than by the presence, the work, the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus. So I want to ask you, what's in your imagination? What do you imagine Christ coming to be or to mean? What do you envision? Are you like me, scarred by blueprint making, maybe a little bit? Thanks. Or have you adopted another way of seeing Christ coming? perhaps not as another stage or dispensation to come, but as a Christ who is drawing near, perhaps always near. This is the invitation of the first Sunday of Advent. What do we imagine? What do we hope for? And how does this imagination shape who we are and what we do today? The question that I'd like to pose is not so much when is Christ coming, but how is Christ returning and coming today? So what is this other way of seeing the scriptures? Matthew 24 and the prophecies of the Son of Man and the prophecies of the scriptures of 1,000 years and two people walking and one suddenly gone and the other left, respectively. First, to deal with the prophecy of Revelation for the 1,000 years, is to interpret the 1,000 years as figurative language, sort of $7 million, or 7 million Pepsi points for the Harrier jet, that speaks not to a craving for soda, but to a longing for Christ's fullness to be upon us. This interpretation is actually called realized eschatology, or now millennialism. It would contend that the promised return of Christ happened at the resurrection, which initiated a resurrection life. In this realized eschatology, it's not an outline blueprint that we're trying to eventuate through politics or power, but a hope available to us now through God's Spirit. The two people walking, with one suddenly gone and the other left, this is understood not so much as a prediction of the rapture, but as a reminder that our time is brief. Which is actually much closer to the reading of Matthew's chapter 24 and 25, that tomorrow is not to be counted. Invest as you can today. Don't bury your head in the sand. Don't bury your coins, but instead invest. Get involved. Be a part of this world. Do not just bury what God has given you, which is much closer to the actual thrust of the passage. Christ here and now. Now, through our Advent reflections, I believe we're invited into this space. Invited into a space where Christ is not then, but Christ is here. Through our Advent reflections, I hope that these become sort of a way that you can reflect and be centered, a way that you can begin to experience Advent as the practice of Christ coming. If you would, if you have your phone with me, I'm going to take you to where the Advent reflections are, and I hope this is going to be kind of cool. We'll see. Probably not. But if you open it up and you just put in your URL, ubccolumbus.org, you'll see our church's website. Now, on this website, if you go to your menu bar on the right side, you'll see Advent Reflections 2022. I learned how to update our website. Took me a bit, actually. Okay, so if you click on Advent Reflections, you'll see Reflections Blog, or Advent Reflections Blog. If you click on that, can you read what it says? Anybody?
No blog.
That's right, that's what it's supposed to say. No blog post yet. Okay? So the blog post is actually scheduled to drop, I guess as they say, at 11:25 a.m. today. So after worship, or maybe during worship, depending on where we're at, the blog will come. And it's actually by the rector over at St. Stephen's, Carl Stevens, in fact. So he wrote our first Advent reflection. I pray that it can be with you a way of Christ coming, a place where you can center yourself and ask what Christ is doing here and now. I pray that it can be a way for you to connect. Not just connect with these reflections, but to connect with the folks who wrote them. In fact, when they come, and those blogs, we'll also have a printed version too, but when those blog posts drop, they'll have the name of the person beside them, the author. So we can tag back to those. And if you want to share them, you can do that as well. And it kind of adds some traffic to the website. Ta-da. So I hope that it can be a grounding place for you in this Christmas season. One that not only prepares you for the day when Christ's fullness is manifest here and now, but in the today, when that same Christ presence is available to you. May God be